The air in the chamber was thick, heavy with anticipation. Mark stood, hands clenched behind his back, trying to ignore the thrumming unease in his chest. The room was large, more cavern than hall, with jagged walls of black stone that seemed to absorb light. Strange, bioluminescent veins ran through the rock, pulsing with a rhythm Mark couldn't quite decipher. His gaze shifted to the figure standing at the center of the room. She stood like a statue, perfect in every way, her skin a shimmering silver beneath the soft glow of the lights. Her eyes, large and obsidian black, glistened with an intensity that made Mark's pulse quicken. For a moment, he felt the weight of her gaze pierce him in a way no human could ever achieve. Her name was Nira. They had met only days ago, but in those brief moments, Mark had seen something that twisted in him, something rare, something special. She wasn't like the women back home. She had a quiet strength, an elegance that hid something darker, something potent. But Mark had assumed, with the kind of arrogance that only an outsider could possess, that he understood her. He thought he could protect her. He thought she was vulnerable. The whispering voices of the council filled the air like the sound of 1,000 wings fluttering. The elders, seated on their thrones of bone and obsidian, were waiting. Mark was the outsider here, the alien among them. And though he didn't understand all the customs, one thing was clear: this wasn't a wedding. Not yet. But the people of Xanda, her people, had their ways. Their rites. Their rituals. He had come here expecting to shield her from what he believed was an oppressive culture. He thought he was the savior, the knight in shining armor. But as the moments dragged on, as Nira's stillness began to feel more like a silent warning, Mark realized he might be the one who needed saving. Mark! Nira's voice was low, almost a whisper, yet it echoed through the chamber like a distant thunderclap. He turned toward her. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice strained. He couldn't hide the doubt that gnawed at him. "You don't have to go through with it. I can." "No," she cut him off. Her voice was steady now, unshaken. "This is my choice. I've chosen this path." Her words made his heart falter. He didn't know what to make of it. He had watched her, observed the subtle ways she moved, the way she looked at him when they were alone. She had seemed so small, so fragile. And the thought of what her people might demand from her made something inside him churn violently. A low hum reverberated through the floor beneath his feet, and the elders stood, their dark robes billowing as they approached the center of the room. Nira didn't flinch. Her posture remained regal, unwavering, as if she had been here before, and as if she knew exactly what would come next. One of the elders stepped forward, a figure cloaked in deep crimson, their face hidden beneath a mask of silver. The voice that emanated from beneath the mask was deep, resonant, and full of authority. "The bonding has begun," the elder intoned, his words ringing out in the chamber. "Mark of Earth, you stand as witness. Your heart will decide, for you hold the power of life and death over this one. Will you claim her as your own?" Mark froze. He had thought, foolishly, that the rituals would be about offering protection, of declaring his intentions toward her. But this was not what he had expected. Nira's gaze met his, steady as always, yet there was something hidden behind her eyes that made his stomach drop. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't pleading. She was asking him to see beyond his assumptions, beyond his own narrow vision of what was right. Mark stuttered, caught between the terror of what was happening and the sudden realization that he had been playing at something far larger than himself. What do you mean?" The elder's voice was cold, an unblinking reflection of the world around them. "The bonding is not a marriage as you understand it. It is an agreement of power, of commitment to a shared cause. You are an outsider, a stranger in our lands. But she has chosen you to stand at her side, to be her partner." Mark's thoughts raced, but before he could protest, Nira spoke. "I have chosen," she repeated, her words like steel. "To bond with you, Mark. But only if you accept the weight of what it means. If you are afraid, if you hesitate, the bond will break. And you will lose me forever." For a moment, the chamber went silent, save for the pulsing hum of the walls. Mark's heart thudded painfully in his chest. What was she asking? What was this strange and twisted tradition? He wanted to shout, to protest, to tell her she didn't need to do this, that they could leave, run far away from whatever strange and ancient custom this was. But then he looked into her eyes again, and something shifted. In those depths, he saw not vulnerability, but an ocean of strength. A power so deep it could never be hidden. He had been wrong about her all along. And then, as if to confirm the truth he had been avoiding, the elder's voice rang out once more. Mark of Earth, will you accept the bonding, or will you deny the choice of the one who calls you her partner? Mark's throat went dry. The weight of the question pressed on him like a mountain. His mind raced, but his heart whispered the truth. He had already made his choice. Mark's boots clicked sharply against the metallic floor of the Cavallara's deck, a haunting echo against the vast emptiness that surrounded him. He could see the stars outside the observation window, glittering like cold diamonds in the deep black void of space. But inside the ship, everything felt wrong. The hum of the engines should have been comforting, but it only heightened his unease. He turned, adjusting the collar of his military uniform, the fabric still unfamiliar, despite the weeks he'd spent in this alien world. Aren't you going to congratulate me? A voice broke through his thoughts, teasing, but with a note of genuine curiosity. Mark's eyes snapped to the doorway, his pulse spiking for an entirely different reason. There she was, Lena. The woman who had turned his world upside down. He swallowed, forcing himself to meet her gaze. She stood in the doorway like a vision from a forgotten myth, tall and poised, her movements fluid and graceful despite the chaos of their surroundings. Her dark eyes locked on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Her skin shimmered faintly in the low light, her appearance almost ethereal, like she was part of the night itself, not a person at all. Her features, sharp and regal, were as alien to him as the customs of her people. And yet, the more time he spent around her, the more he realized he was drawn to the depth of them. Her strength, her fire, her quiet wisdom. It was something he couldn't fully comprehend. And that scared him. Congratulations on what? He asked, trying to keep his tone casual, though he knew she wasn't here to simply chat. She stepped further into the room, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. You're playing the game, Mark, she said, her voice light, almost playful, but her words carried the weight of something much more dangerous. You've seen the ceremony, now you know what that means. Mark grimaced, running a hand through his dark hair. I didn't know it meant a damn thing. You didn't tell me about any ceremony before. You should have warned me, Lena. Lena arched a brow, crossing her arms as if she were savoring his discomfort. Warned you? Why? You saw what you were supposed to see. Everything you think you understand, that's what I let you see. She tilted her head, studying him like a scientist observing a specimen. You're thinking in human terms. You're so sure that I misunderstood what happened, but the truth is, you're the one who's confused. The words hit harder than he expected, a dull ache spreading in his chest. He wanted to push back, to ask more questions, but something in her expression made him hesitate. For a moment, all he saw was the distance between them. The cavernous gulf of two worlds colliding. That ritual, it was meant to be a proposal. His voice cracked as he spoke the words aloud, like it was some kind of absurdity. Lena's lips curled into a smile, slow and deliberate. Yes. But not just any proposal, Mark. It's a bond that binds us. It ties us to one another, to the life we are about to share. It's an oath. Mark's stomach twisted as he pieced it together. The ceremony, the symbols, the exchange of blood, the binding ritual. It was a contract, but more than that, it was a declaration of commitment. But why hadn't she explained that to him? He should have known better. He was a soldier. He was trained to recognize power plays when he saw them. And yet he had walked right into this one. His mind raced, but Lena's next words pulled him back into the moment. Do you understand now? She asked, her gaze piercing. There was a challenge there, a test in her eyes. Or do you need me to explain it further, human? The way she said, human, made him bristle, but it also reminded him that no matter how close he'd grown to her in the last few weeks, they were still strangers in so many ways. Different cultures, different backgrounds, different values. He couldn't afford to be blinded by her beauty or the chemistry between them. He couldn't afford to ignore what was happening. He crossed his arms, leaning against the bulkhead of the ship as he tried to gather his thoughts. "I get it, okay?" he said, forcing the words out. "But you're going to have to forgive me if I'm not exactly overjoyed at the idea of being bound. I thought we were just getting to know each other. I didn't think you'd." "You didn't think." She finished his sentence, her voice dropping into something softer, almost sympathetic, but still laced with authority. "I don't think you understand how vulnerable you are, Mark. In our culture, you're not just an ally. You're more. Much more." He felt his temper flare. "And I'm supposed to just go along with that. You didn't even ask me. I'm not some pawn in a game you're playing. I don't care about the damn ceremony." Lena's eyes flashed with something like amusement, but there was something darker beneath it. "No, you're not a pawn. But you are mine now." Her voice dropped low, but the words were clear, each syllable wrapping around him like a chains. "And there's no going back from this, Mark. The bond is already sealed. You belong to me. And I belong to you. It's that simple." For a moment, Mark didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth, closed it again. He was torn between fury and confusion. What had he really gotten himself into? "I didn't ask for this," he finally muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction he'd hoped for. "No," Lena agreed, stepping closer, her gaze never leaving his. "But you've got it anyway." A beat passed before she added, her tone now unreadable. "Welcome to my world." Mark stood there in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. Everything had changed. He wasn't sure how or when, but he knew one thing: he couldn't escape now. Mark leaned back against the cold, metallic wall of the shuttle, feeling the pulse of the ship's engines reverberate through his spine. The hum was a steady reminder that he was far from home, out of his depth in a way that felt suffocating. The stars outside blinked like distant promises of a future he wasn't sure he'd ever reach. "I still don't understand," he muttered to himself, his breath fogging slightly in the air as he stared at the view outside. Lyra had left him moments ago, abruptly. He'd expected her to linger, to explain herself, to clear up the confusion that had started to gnaw at him ever since their first encounter on the Cavallara. But instead, she'd simply walked away, her every step resonating with a quiet power that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. And then there was the strange gesture she'd made in the ceremonial hall earlier. He could still feel the weight of her eyes on him as she moved, gliding, like she was a part of the air itself, and the words she'd spoken that, at the time, had seemed like a throwaway joke. "You just proposed to me, human." His head swam with the implications. Was she joking? Was this some sort of alien tradition he hadn't studied enough to understand? Or worse, had he, somehow, insulted her in a way that would never be fully undone? Before he could lose himself in his thoughts completely, the low, unmistakable hum of approaching footsteps reached his ears. He looked up, instinctively straightening, though part of him wished she would leave him to his spiraling thoughts. Lyra entered, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. Her skin was the deep color of the Calyx planet's twilight sky, her eyes a sharp silver that flickered with an intelligence far too ancient for her years. Every movement of hers, no matter how small, carried the weight of centuries of her people's customs, so foreign, so far beyond his grasp. "You're still here," she said, her voice even, though Mark could sense the edge beneath it. "I thought you might have fled by now." "Fled?" His voice was rougher than he intended. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until I understand what happened." Her lips twitched slightly, as though amused by his stubbornness. "You misunderstand, Mark." She stepped forward, close enough now that he could see the faint pulse of energy beneath her skin, the subtle hum that told him just how much power she kept carefully contained. "You're not in a position to understand everything. You never were." He frowned. "You're saying I don't have a choice in this? That I can't ask questions?" Lyra's gaze softened, just for a moment. I didn't say that. But your questions must be careful. Not all knowledge is meant for you to wield. Not all customs should be explained, at least not until you understand the weight of what they mean. Mark clenched his fists at his sides. This was the problem, the walls she'd built between them. He didn't even know if she cared about him beyond whatever was necessary for her culture's laws. Was it even possible to break through? Did he want to? You didn't answer me, he said, his voice strained. What you said back there, you didn't seem confused by it. You acted like you knew exactly what I was doing. Why did you let me think I was? He struggled to find the right words, but nothing felt right, nothing felt real in the context of what had just happened. You proposed, Mark, she said, her tone now thick with something he couldn't quite place. You proposed in the way your people do, without realizing the consequences. I didn't. He stopped himself, realizing that the last few hours had been a blur of confusion and frustration, that what had felt like a simple mistake could have deeper implications than he understood. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to bring his thoughts together. I didn't mean to propose. I didn't even know I was proposing. What happened back there? Lyra took a breath, as though considering her words carefully. In my culture, she began slowly, a proposal, of any kind, is a binding contract. It is not a casual exchange. It carries weight beyond the words themselves. When you presented yourself as a potential mate, you offered far more than what you realized. Mark swallowed hard. He'd only tried to show her he cared, to be there for her in a way that felt right. He hadn't meant to trap himself into something he didn't understand. Wait, he said, stepping forward. You said potential mate? Is that how you see this? You're just going to pretend we don't have a choice? Because if that's how this works, I'm not. No, she interrupted, her voice a little too sharp. It is not how I see this. It is how my people see it. A proposal is not a decision you make lightly. And to be clear, yes, you did offer it. But I'm not saying you must follow through. We will, however, need to make our intentions clear to those who will hold us accountable. Mark's chest tightened. So you're saying, we have no choice, she finished, her gaze unwavering. But you could leave at any time. The choice is yours, Mark. But be aware, should you choose to walk away, it will not go unnoticed. And it will not be without consequence. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his throat. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something far deeper, something that reached into the very core of their connection, something he couldn't escape now. I didn't know, he muttered. I didn't know it was this serious. Lyra took a step closer, her presence all-encompassing, powerful. You've always been serious, Mark. Whether you realize it or not. And as he stared into her eyes, he knew she wasn't just speaking about the proposal. She was speaking about everything, the challenge of understanding each other, the struggle of finding common ground in a universe so vast, so filled with unknowns. The question now was whether he was willing to fight for that understanding, or if the weight of it would break him. He couldn't tell yet. But he knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The atmosphere was thick with a mix of tension and unspoken words as Mark entered the observation deck, his boots making soft, muffled sounds against the glossy floor. He paused, eyes immediately locking with the figure standing by the vast viewport. She was gazing out at the swirling nebula, her dark, angular features softened by the soft light spilling through the observation window. Zara. Mark's heart lurched at the sight of her. Even after weeks of traveling together across the stars, he couldn't quite understand what it was about her that pulled him in, that made every moment with her feel both exhilarating and excruciating at the same time. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, commanding, serene, and yet so utterly different. Or maybe it was because she'd shattered everything he thought he knew about power and vulnerability in one sentence. You've just proposed, human. The words echoed in his mind. He had no idea what he had done wrong. They had barely talked since the incident, and the space between them had only grown heavier with each passing hour. She had barely looked at him, much less spoken to him, since the night he had thought, foolishly, that he could protect her. The cultural misunderstanding still stung, and Mark wasn't sure if there was a way out of this awkward silence. But he had to try. "Zara," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. She didn't turn immediately, and Mark felt an unsettling sense of being dismissed, even though he was standing right there, a mere few meters from her. "I'm sorry," he continued, stepping closer, his gaze flickering to the swirling colors of the nebula outside. "I know I messed up. But I don't want things to be weird between us." Finally, she shifted, her sharp eyes catching his as she tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Zara was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, it was often something that left him stunned, something that made him question his assumptions about her and about himself. "You did not mess up, human," she said, her voice low and firm, almost like a command. "You simply did not understand." "I know that now," Mark said, feeling a lump form in his throat. "But I still don't get it. How could I have proposed to you? I thought I was offering protection, you know? A promise. A vow." Zara took a step toward him, her posture rigid but graceful, like the hunter she was. "Where I come from, protection is not something one offers lightly, human. It is a bond that demands equal strength and trust." Mark blinked, trying to process her words. "But we're not. I'm not. I am not weak." Zara cut him off, her voice sharp, as if daring him to deny it. "You, with your humane desire to shield me, assumed my need for defense. But I do not need defending. I need allies." Her gaze softened, just slightly, as she studied him. "And that is why it is difficult for me to understand you, human. You see the world through your own lenses, with your own fragile sense of strength and weakness. You think you can fix everything. But you can't." Mark felt a surge of frustration rise in his chest. "I wasn't trying to fix you, Zara. I was trying to protect you from what I knew was coming. We're in deep shit here, and Do you think I do not know that?" Zara's voice cut through his words like a knife. "Do you think I do not know what we face?" Mark froze. He hadn't meant to imply she was ignorant, but somehow his words had come across as condescending. And that was the last thing he wanted. The last thing Zara needed. She stepped closer now, the air between them growing taut, almost electric. "I do not need your protection, Mark. What I need is your respect. I need you to understand that I am not helpless. I will not be diminished by your efforts to save me." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for the first time in a long while, Mark found himself questioning his place in this strange, new world they inhabited. Zara paused, as if measuring his reaction, before her expression shifted, just a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. It was brief, but it made his stomach tighten. "You were right about one thing, human," she said, her voice softer now, though still imbued with a quiet authority. "We are in this together. I did not think you were capable of understanding that. But perhaps I was wrong." Mark exhaled slowly, a sense of relief washing over him as the tension between them seemed to lessen, if only by a fraction. "So what now?" he asked cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara's eyes flickered to the viewport again, her gaze distant as the stars stretched out before them. "Now we survive. Together. But no more misunderstandings, Mark. No more false assumptions. We will have to walk this path side by side, without the delusions of what we think we should be to each other." He nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle in. It wasn't going to be easy, but if they were going to make it through the dangers ahead, he was going to have to leave his assumptions behind, and see Zara for who she truly was, not who he had hoped she might be. And that, Mark realized, was a much more terrifying, and much more beautiful, proposition than any protection he could ever offer.